Hey everyone, I'm your host, Monica Clavijo of the Bear Experiment podcast, where we dive deep into the human experience, the challenges, the triumphs, and everything in between. Today's episode is one that will touch the very core of what it means to live and to let go. I'm joined by an extraordinary guest, Penny, who's a hospice nurse, and her journey has been nothing short of remarkable. Penny has walked alongside people in their final moments, witnessing their last words, their regrets, and the mysterious bursts of energy that they often come with at the very last moment when they pass. She's experienced the profound, the spiritual, and even the unexplainable in most ways that none of us will ever imagine. But Penny's story doesn't start here. Before she found her calling, she faced her own darkness, struggling with addiction, navigating the consequences of her choices, and making the heartbreaking decision to let her son's father raise him for a better life. Penny found her purpose through these trials and now helps others transition into the next chapter with dignity and compassion. In this episode, we'll explore what dying really looks like, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. Are we in pain when we die? Why do some people experience visions and even messages from the other side? What can death teach us about how we can live? We'll also delve deep into questions about faith, reincarnation, and the ethics about assisted dying, or MAID. And Penny will share some of her strangest, most profound experiences that she's had while sitting with patients in their final hours. This is more than just a conversation about death. It's a conversation about life, faith, and the resilience of the human spirit. So grab a cup of tea, find a quiet moment, and join me as we take this profound journey together. This is the Bear Experiment podcast. Let's dive in, and thanks for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe to our channel.
Thank
It's great
you.
stuff. Yeah, it's important things, to be able to feel more comfortable with talking about the right, the death process, right? Like there's so many unanswered questions that we all have about that, and um alongside with the grieving that we go through for losing a loved one. So um thank you again. Welcome to the Bear Experiment podcast. I'm your host, Monica Clavijo, and today we are joined by hospice nurse Penny. She does amazing work assisting individuals with their transition to the other side. She's been doing this for 17 years now,
Almost 20.
almost 20 years. So she's got some interesting stories to share about that. But part of her advocacy is to share her knowledge on what she's experienced with these patients as they transition. Um, in order to be more comfortable with accepting what's the inevitable, right? We're all going to get there. It's there's no way out of this one. Um so thank you again. So why don't you share a little bit of your story? Like how did you get started and had this amazing calling, because this is not something that just anybody can do.
So I actually did not become a nurse until I was in my 40s. I
Mhm.
was getting a divorce from my second husband, and I went to nursing school because I had no career to fall back on. I had been a bartender in previous life, and during the 10 years we were married, I was a stay-at-home homeschooling mom. So I knew I needed to have some kind of a career to be able to support myself and my daughters. So I went to nursing school, and I went into hospice because I felt the need to do service work. Earlier in my life, I had been kind of a failure to launch. Got in trouble with the law, was arrested a few times, had a drug issue. And so I felt like I wanted to do service work. And I had had experience with hospice because a year before I went to nursing school, my husband at the time, his stepmother had cancer and went on hospice. I didn't even know what it was up until that point and never even heard of it. But when I met the hospice nurses, I really felt like, oh, they're doing sacred work. Like this is service
Oh
work.
yeah.
So it was something that just really spoke to me. I really wanted to do that. And I did not think that LPN, so I started off as a licensed practical nurse. I did not think that LPNs could work in hospice. So it was in the plan for me to eventually become an RN and become a hospice nurse. So at first, I went and worked in a clinic for a year. And then I decided to go to a hospital so I could get some more direct patient care under my belt in preparing for going back to school and becoming an RN. Unfortunately, hospitals often will lay LPNs off, like they do this cyclical layoff every 10 years or so. And they laid me off. Well, during that time, I had divorced my husband and started dating somebody new, and there was a hospice care center in his neighborhood. And I passed by it all the time, going to his house, and I was like, oh, I'm going to work there someday. I'm going to be an RN and I'm going to work there someday. Well, when I got laid off, I thought, you know what? I should just go and see if they hire LPNs. I really didn't know for sure that they didn't. I just assumed. And I went there, and sure enough, they had one LPN position that was coming available. They were brand new. They were just opening. So they had one LPN position opening up, and they hired me. And from then on, it was, all the way. It was pretty much hospice nurse the whole time. Once I got my RN, I worked in an ER for about 3 months, and I hated that. And then I went back to hospice, and that's really all I've ever done.
So as a nurse, that's you're there. Are you pretty much living with the family at that point? Do you go in shifts? Like, how does that work?
No. So in a hospice care center, the patients are staying at the facility, and
Gotcha.
usually they are there because they have acute symptom management needs. They need a higher level of care, so they have to have skilled nursing. So they qualify for a Medicare higher level of care called general inpatient or GIP. So that was where I first started working. So for the first 7 years of being a hospice nurse, I worked at these hospice care centers. So these people come here with acute symptom management needs, and the intent is to get their symptoms managed and then send them back home. Well, when people are close to the end of their life, they often will have an exacerbation of symptoms. So
Hmm.
most of the patients who came to the care center would die at the care center. From there, I went into home hospice, and I was a case manager. So home hospice, people think it's like a nurse is going to come and stay there the whole time, and that's not how it is at all. The family are the caregivers, or hired caregivers are the caregivers, or if they live in a nursing home, then the nursing home staff are the caregivers. And we go in and we train the family or whoever the caregivers are on how to take care of that dying person. We do the symptom management with them. We do wound care with them. We do skilled procedures with them as well. But a huge part of what we do as home hospice nurses is educate and the family on what to expect when their person is dying and how to take care of them. Now, I don't work doing direct patient care anymore. I'm now a hospice quality assurance nurse. So I've done everything from, bedside nursing and inpatient, home hospice case management, education, regulatory, and quality is what I currently do. So Medicare requires that hospice agencies have a very robust quality assurance program. And so I'm a quality assurance nurse, and we work on performance improvement and educating staff and that type of thing.
And how was it when your first patient, when you experienced, a person dying for the first time? Like, what were you feeling at that point? Was it difficult? Was it something that came very natural to you?
I would say it came natural to me, and I had no experience with dying people or dead people. I'd never even seen a dead person when I became a hospice nurse. I did have an experience with death anxiety, which is very common. A lot of people have fear around death and dying.
Hmm.
In my 30s, I had it really significantly. It was crippling to me at times. That I would just really perseverate on, oh, what happens after we die. And once I started working in hospice, that really went away. Seeing people deathbed visioning, seeing just being around people dying so much, like, oh, this is going to happen to everybody, and there's
Right.
nothing that we can do to stop it. We
Exactly.
just have to accept it. And once you get to that place of accepting it, then you don't worry about it as much. But I cannot remember the first patient that I cared for who died. I've cared for thousands of dying people.
Right.
I don't remember the first person, but I do remember the first experience that really impacted me significantly. And that was with a nun who was dying. And I'm sorry, she wasn't a nun. Her daughter was a nun, and she had a lot of nuns visiting.
Hmm.
And one night, the last visitor to leave was a nun, and she came to the nurse's station and she told me, "Oh, she's gone." And I thought she meant she died. And I stood up with my stethoscope and I said, "Oh." And she said, "No, no. Her body is still here doing the work of dying, but her spirit has left. You can see it in her
Oh
eyes."
my God. I have goosebumps all over my body right now, Penny.
Yeah, so I went in after she left. I was curious and I went in after she left and I could see what she was talking about. Like people, when they're dying, they get to this point where their eyes are open or partially open, but the lights are on, but nobody's home. Like
Right.
there's nobody in there. You can just kind of see. It's just like this vacant stare. They're not looking at anything. And I knew exactly what she meant when she said that. Like, yeah, I get it. The body is still here and
Yeah.
it's still working towards the end of its life, but the spirit is gone. It's left the building.
So my father passed away October the 18th, 2019, right before the pandemic, and he had to go to hospice. He got diagnosed with cancer again. He was elder. His body wasn't going to be able to take chemotherapy in the fight, right? So it was just like the inevitable. Let's do this. Let's go home so that he's comfortable. So I was there, and what as uncomfortable, not understanding, right? The education part, what you're providing us with, is the immense love that I felt from the two male nurses who were there. And I thought it was hilarious. My father was in prison in Cuba. He was a political prisoner for 9 years. And he really had a thing against homosexuality, right? And the two nurses were homosexuals that were assigned to him. And they were so amazing to him. The way that they taught my mother on how to better care for him, and he was for 3 weeks, which was amazing because he completely, like, physically changed, like his look, right? He wasn't drinking any water, any fluids, or eating anything for 3 weeks, and he would not pass away.
Hmm. Yeah,
How
I've
is
seen
how
that.
is
I've
how
seen
is that
that.
possible?
It's possible. It doesn't happen very often, but it can happen. It depends on the person's. Often it has to do with their age, it has to do with their determination, it has to do with their physical status, how much reserve they have. If you have somebody who's very, very thin at the end of life, they're not going to usually live very long, but somebody that has a lot of reserve on them can.
Mm-hmm.
I have had a patient who lived for 3 weeks with no food or water. Typically, what we say, so there's this thing called voluntary stop eating and drinking that people can do if they want to end their life, if they're terminally ill and they want to end their life. So they can stop eating and drinking. It's legal in every state, anybody can
Uh-huh.
do it. And we usually say if somebody stops eating and drinking, they don't live longer than about 7 to 10 days. If they stop eating, but they continue to take fluids, then they
Right.
can live longer, about 3 weeks usually. But that's just a kind of a rule of thumb. And there are exceptions to the rule. And I've seen that happen too, where somebody lived for 3 weeks. And you wonder when they get like that, you're like, first of all, the family starts to really stress out about it.
Hmm.
Like,
Right, exactly. Because you're like,
they're suffering. Why
he's
aren't they dying? They're
exactly. He's
suffering.
in pain. He's got to be
Yeah,
thirsty. We got to give him something, right?
right.
Like, let's help
Yeah,
him out. And the nurse would tell me the exact same thing that you're saying. Like, no, this is good. This is a good
yeah,
thing, you know?
yes,
He's not
yeah.
suffering. He's not in any pain. He was moaning a lot though, for a couple of days before he just stopped altogether. Like he would not stop. It was almost like a chant that he was doing.
Okay, I can tell you what that is. And I used to think when I first became a hospice nurse, I thought it was moaning, and I would throw all kinds of pain medications at the people, and they would still be doing it. Right? It's very rhythmic. Oh, sorry, my dog
Yes.
is
No, it's
shaking.
okay.
It's very rhythmic. It's like, oh,
Yes.
oh, yeah.
Yes, that.
So I stopped referring to that as a moan because it really isn't signifying that the person is in pain. It's just a noise that they make. And I call it an expiratory sigh. It's just a sigh. It's like, ah, ah. And
Like
it
for com
doesn't,
for their own inner comfort.
Maybe. I mean, it could be, like some people, what they stim, like maybe they're stimming. I don't know, but what the way that we tell if somebody's uncomfortable when they're unresponsive is we look at their face. That's the first thing that we look at. Are
Hmm.
they relaxed through here? Like people get really creased up in the forehead if they're uncomfortable. So people are usually relaxed in the face, and we know that they're comfortable. And the fact that it's very rhythmic like that tells us that it's not pain that's driving that noise. If it was like, occasional, but it's with the
Right.
breath that they're doing it. It's with the
Correct.
expiration that they're doing. So yeah, and so that's one thing. Like you feel like, oh, your person's. So I always say this: lingering does not equal suffering for the person who's dying, but it
Hmm.
can be really hard on the family because they are waiting for that person to die, and that is just the most awful feeling.
Horrible, horrible.
Like,
I think I got like 3 calls that he was passing and he wouldn't go. And
yeah.
we would tell ourselves, like, what is he waiting for? What is holding him? What is he holding on to? We're all here. We're saying it's okay to go. Like,
Yeah.
we're going to be okay. We're going to be okay. He was a great father. And so he was a really intellectual man. We spoke a lot. Like I told you, he had a very difficult life. He was in prison from 20 to 30 years old, in Cuba. And while he was still coherent, we would speak a lot about this in particular, like what's going to happen when we die? Where do we go? Do our loved ones actually come and really greet us and walk with us, right? So many stories you hear where they start talking to a dead relative right before they pass and they're speaking with them. So share some stories, like what have been some common things that you've seen it with patients within their last dying moments. I know that a lot of them, start kind of like grabbing the air, like if they're almost like pulling themselves up. Um,
Hmm. Yeah, we see people reaching a lot, reaching into the air, oftentimes up above or to the corner of the room. And that is often where people will say that they see those deceased loved ones. That's where they'll usually say, yeah, they're up in the corner of the room or they're up above me. I've seen that many, many times. And so to me, this reaching, maybe they're reaching out to those visions. People also do things with their hands, like picking at their clothes, or they'll do things with their hands like smoking a cigarette if they were a smoker, or tying flies. I've had lots of patients who were fishermen who would be going like this, and the family would say, oh, he's tying flies. He was a fly fisherman. Needlepoint, this type of stuff that they do with their hands. I had one patient who was still coherent enough to kind of communicate with her daughter about what was happening and when she was doing this stuff. And I wasn't there for this. The daughter told me about it. So I met this lady on a Saturday. She had been admitted from the hospital on Friday. And then I was working the weekend. So I saw her on Saturday and I saw her on Sunday. And it was like a crash course in end of life care because I could tell this woman was just really tanking fast.
hmm
And so then she does die. And the daughter calls and says, I want to tell you about what happened. And she said that her mom started touching her chest like this. And the daughter thought she was touching her gown. And her mom said, well, I need this. And her daughter said, your gown? And she said, no, this. And she started motioning to her skin. And then she held her hands up and she said, well, I need these. And the daughter said, I don't know, mom. And then she said, she started reaching up in the air and said, there's windows right here. And she was talking about windows, and she was telling the daughter that these were things in her life that had happened. Like she was explaining to her daughter these memories that she could see in these windows. And I just thought it was fascinating because, I think people do, back to like, why do people linger? I think people review their life. I think they do
Yeah.
life review. I think they process things that happened in their life. And so it was really interesting because she was able to articulate that she could see, these things.
The different experiences in her life through these window panels.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
interesting. That's so interesting. Have you ever encountered any like entities that have been present in the room?
No, I
Or-
never have. And people will ask me, well, have any of your patients ever come to see you after they died? No, my dad did, but none of my patients. And I always say, well, why would they? I was just their nurse for a short period of time,
Right.
like they're going to go see their family members. But I will say that when somebody dies, there is a definite feeling of a shift of energy in the room. Like you
Okay.
can just kind of feel it. Like there's just something different when somebody dies. It's like a shift of energy. But I've never seen any kind of, other than my dad, spirits in the rooms of my patients. But I've heard of other people saying that. One of my friends who I met through TikTok was a 25-year-old young woman who had breast cancer, terminal breast cancer. And she was on TikTok. She was a creator and she was sharing her journey with cancer. And I found out she lived in Spokane, which is about 3 hours from me. So I went and met her in real life. And she had started seeing cats in the house that weren't her living cats. They were other, like, cat spirits. And her mom said she also was seeing these spirits of these cats in the house. So people do have like these shared experiences where they see, those types of entities. But
Yeah.
I wouldn't expect to as the nurse. I would think that's more like the family is going to have that experience.
Do you notice, have you had any encounters with patients right before they're transitioning where they can still articulate, where there's a sense of like, how do they feel? Are they regretful for certain things that they never did in their life? Do they feel love and just want to share and express that love with their families one last time before they go? Is there a sense, do we feel a sense of regret right before we're passing?
Some people do. I wouldn't say right before. And also, like Hollywood loves to give these beautiful
Yeah.
endings where people say these famous last words and then they close their eyes and they die. I don't know how your dad died. My dad actually did die like that. He said to the nurse, "I'm about ready to hang it up," and then he died.
No
But
way.
but most of the time, people don't die like that. We
Right.
don't know what their last words are until after they've died, because when they're speaking those words, we don't know that that's
That
the
that's
last
gonna
thing
be
that
the last
they're
word,
going to
right?
say, right? They don't just like, gosh, I wish I would have spent more time with my family, close their eyes and die.
Right.
But people along the way will often share their regrets, that they wish that they would have spent more time with their family, less time at work. They wish
Right.
they hadn't been dieting all the time. They wish they would have, you know, enjoyed life more, gone on a vacation. What you would expect are typical regrets that people will have at
It's
the end of their
that's why I think that this conversation is so important and fascinating at the same time, because sometimes it takes a reflection at deaths in order for you to appreciate that we're here now and we're alive. And we are always worried and stressed out and worried about paying our bills and
Yeah,
getting in a fight with our friends, and I'm never going to talk to them again. And tomorrow's not promised to anybody, right?
right.
So why do patients, like, I've read also, and through your social media, which, as I told you, it's fantastic. I love it. I could be there for hours.
Thank
Um,
you.
why do they get like a sudden burst of energy also, like right before, where you're like, oh my God, they're not going to die. They're getting better. And then boom, they're out.
Yeah, and not everybody has that. So about 4 out of 10, statistically, 4 out of 10 people will have that, what we call an end of life rally. The medical term for that is terminal. Okay. Oh, terminal lucidity. I was trying to
Okay.
remember what it's called. Terminal lucidity. That's kind of a new name for it.
Uh-huh.
Like my whole time being a hospice nurse, it's always been the rally. Some people call it the surge, but terminal lucidity is something that was only kind of, that word was only kind of invented a few years ago.
Okay.
There's no explanation for it. The most plausible possibility that people have come up with is that the body, as the organs are shutting down, the body can start to excrete hormones.
Okay, that makes
And
sense.
hormones, steroids I can't talk. Steroids are hormones, and we know that steroids perk people up. Like when we give steroids to a person who's dying for symptom management, it will perk them up. It'll make them more awake. It'll give them an appetite when they didn't have one before. So steroids can do that. So if a person's organs are shutting down and they're excreting hormones, it's possible that that is what is creating that last little burst of
Of
energy.
energy that they get.
right, which doesn't last long, usually 24 hours or less, and then they almost always die within a week. Of course, when that happens, people think, oh, they're getting better, they can come off of hospice. But the reality is they're usually close to the end of their life. And sometimes the what can happen is really profound. Like with somebody that has dementia, all of a sudden they remember
They
everybody.
remember everything. Isn't it
Mhm.
amazing the way that the mind works, the brain? It's incredible, right? Like so many the older I get, the more I know that I don't know anything, you know? Do you, in your experience, during those last moments, are people in pain? Are they feeling pain, or is it kind of like a smooth transition, painless transition?
Most of the time, I mean, we are giving people pain medication if they're having pain. Dying itself is not necessarily painful. I've had patients who died from dementia, which isn't typically going to be painful, who never got pain medications. If you're dying from cancer, then usually there's a lot of pain involved. Most of the time, we're able to control pain really well with medications. Every now and then, we're not. And then we end up doing palliative sedation with people where we give them medication so that they can sleep until their death. But most of the time, I haven't seen people be in pain up until their death. Getting there sometimes can be a bumpy road, and people can experience some significant pain until we get that managed. But usually at the end of life, people are pretty comfortable and they relax and they die peacefully.
Is there any truth that receiving morphine when you're kind of like at the very end, that it speeds up the death process, or is that just a myth?
No, so I always say morphine doesn't cause a person's death, but it can facilitate it. So, and what I mean by that is when a person is really uncomfortable, it's almost like they're being kept here. Like they can't relax enough just to die. They're just like in pain and they just can't relax. And so when we give them morphine and it relaxes them, then they're able to finally, breathe their last. But morphine in the doses that we give is not causing a person's death. We usually start people pretty low unless they're really opioid tolerant. So if they have cancer and they've been getting a lot of high dose opioids,
Right.
then we may have to give them more and more as time goes on. But when somebody hasn't really had a lot of opioids, the starting dose is usually almost always 5 milligrams of
Okay.
morphine. Now that's equivalent to 5 milligrams of oxycodone is equivalent to 7.5 milligrams of morphine. So
Wow.
oxycodone 5 milligrams is what you find in a Percocet. So
Okay.
a Percocet is more potent
Then
than
the
the
morphine.
starting dose of morphine that we give.
That's
And
interesting.
people don't have any problem with Percocet. They'll be like, yeah, give me the Percocet. But
Yeah,
morphine,
like
oh, morphine will
right.
kill me. But the morphine is actually not as strong, milligram per milligram, as Percocet.
They give you Percocet if they pull out a tooth, you know? It's like they give you
Mhm.
Percocet for anything. Um,
Right.
so I would,
But here's what happens. So morphine is the gold standard in hospice. It works fast. We can give it liquid under the
mm-hmm,
tongue, works really great. Um, and it's cheap. And hospice doesn't get reimbursed a lot of money from Medicare. So we're always looking for like what's going to be our best bang for our buck.
of
Morphine
course.
is tried and true. It works great. Most people on hospice, that's what we're going to give them is morphine.
Yeah.
When somebody goes on hospice, they die. And so people think, oh, the morphine's what caused them to die. They
Uh-huh.
don't think they were dying and that's why they died.
Right.
And we also get really late referrals to hospice. People don't come on until the very last few days of their life. And so that's why there's this association with they went on to hospice and they died in 2 days. So hospice must have caused them to die faster. And
Right.
they don't realize that that person was already dying. So, yeah, we give morphine safely. It's very effective. And there's no ceiling dose on morphine. And that means that you can give a person as
As much.
much morphine as they can tolerate. And that
Mm-hmm.
could be 800 milligrams, but we don't start them at that dose. We
Gotcha.
start small and work our way up.
So I would imagine that, with the work that you're doing as a nurse and caring for patients, the families who are grieving, they're going through such a difficult moment where they're losing a loved one. You're almost like a counselor for them as well. So you're carrying all these different hats while you're in there. Like, how does that make you feel? Like, is that something that's difficult for you to have to, kind of explain to a grieving mother, that their child is passing away and you're there and you're experiencing this as an outsider that's trying to help? Like, how does that affect you personally?
I feel like it's important for people to really understand what's happening, so that they can be present with their person who's dying.
Hmm.
And I've seen people be very fearful when they don't understand what they're seeing. They've never seen it before. It's scary. And so being able to explain that to them, it makes me feel like really happy and satisfied to be able to help them to understand what's happening. If it comes to like really significant grief that is requiring skilled counseling, then that wouldn't be my role, because the hospice team is not just the hospice nurse. There's also a hospice aide that helps with personal care. There's a social worker who helps with counseling and paperwork and resources. And there's a chaplain who does the spiritual care. So there are other team members that work all together. And so it's not always, just the nurse who has to be providing that level of counseling. If it's beyond my scope, then that's when I would call in my other team members to help out.
Of course. And how big of a role does your faith play in dealing with all these situations? Like I said earlier, you're doing something that not a lot of people have the inner strength to be able to be around so much death, right? It's depressing, it's sad, it can take a toll on you personally. How does that work for you with your faith, with your religion?
I don't have any religion. I'm agnostic.
You
So
have you almost have to be. You almost have to be. Yeah.
I mean, I know lots of nurses who are religious, and I know lots who are not, agnostic or atheist or whatever. I think for me, if I was religious when I went into this, then I probably still wouldn't be now, because I would question, why do children die from cancer? That
Right.
that would
Right.
really shake up any religious beliefs that I have.
I can
So,
certainly understand being agnostic with everything that's happening in the world. Exactly. Like, you see a little kid that's passing away, that makes no sense, right?
mhm.
Um, Talk to me a little bit about assisted dying with MAID. It's what,
Medical aid in dying, yeah,
yeah.
made. So
Is
it's
that
only
is
legal in 10 states and the District of Columbia. It's not legal federally. It is legal in my state. I remember when it went to vote, I was a fairly new hospice nurse at that time, and I voted for it in my state. And every
Mhm.
hospice nurse I know voted for it. As much as we love to say, oh, hospice provides lots of dignity for people at the end of their life, we also understand that sometimes there are situations that we can't we can't do anything about it. Existential suffering, probably the main thing, where people can have their physical symptoms managed, but they're suffering existentially and they just want to check out. And I'm all for it. I wish it was federally legal. I think it should be federally legal, and I think it should be accessible. But basically, it's allowing a person who meets certain criteria, that they are terminal and that they have a life expectancy of 6 months or less, can receive a prescription that will end their life safely.
Mhm.
And when people don't have access to that, then they will often take matters into their own hands. And that is tragic, because they don't always die. And there are fates worse than death.
Yeah,
And if they do die, it's traumatic for the family. It's traumatic for any staff who has found them. If they're in a facility, and we had a
of
patient who
course.
hung himself in a bathroom in a hospital, that was horrible. We've had murder suicides where the patient murdered their spouse and then themselves killed
Mhm.
themselves. So there are situations that could be avoided if they were able to access medical aid in dying.
And how is it administered? Is it through IV? Is it something orally that you take?
It's oral.
Uh-huh.
It can be given through a rectal tube or a peg tube, a stomach tube.
Uh-huh.
The person has to self-administer.
Right.
So it's never IV. In Canada, it's IV, and the physicians can administer it. In the United States, it is only able to be self-administered. The person has to be able to take it themselves. The real bummer about that is there are people who can't do that. There are some limitations to medical aid in dying that are really unfortunate. Somebody with dementia cannot qualify for medical aid in dying because when they're within the 6 months of the end of their life, they are not able to be determined to be competent, which is also a requirement. They're not able to self-administer the medication. So people who have dementia, then they might resort to the voluntary stop eating and drinking. So that,
And
there are limitations.
and from the moment that they take the medication, how long normally is that process before they pass?
It depends. They can die within minutes or they can die within
Oh,
hours
so
or a
it's
day.
okay.
So it can take a while sometimes. Everybody's different. It's kind of like a natural death. It's different for everyone.
Yeah. So talk to me a little bit about I have not seen it yet, but I will, your podcast where you're sharing stories like we're doing here today. What's the name of your podcast?
It's called Death Happens: An Insider's Guide to Dying.
Okay.
And I do that with my friend who is a hospice social worker, and she's my partner. And we have been interviewing other people who work in death work, and we also are doing some of our own where we're just talking about hospice, death, and dying,
Hmm.
and telling stories and trying to bust the hospice myths more.
It's important work. It's important education.
Huh.
People need to be comfortable with dying.
Yeah,
We're not going to get away from it. We need to
right.
understand it and we need to be okay with it. Um, and you are also an author. How long ago did you write your book?
I've been writing my book, and I have it right here, of course. It's called Influencing Death, Reframing Dying for Better Living. And I have actually been writing this book for 20 years. I started writing stories when I worked in the inpatient care center. And then I kind of shelved it for a while before I went on to, I have a visitor. Before I went on to TikTok, I was really frustrated with medical shows because I feel like they're they're so inauthentic and
Hmm.
they actually lead to more confusion and fear around death and dying because they portray it so inaccurately. And Amazon at that time had a program where you could go in there and write a script and it would format it into like a regular like television script, and they were selecting amateur scripts for television shows. So I started writing that in there, and then they got rid of the program. They were like, "Yeah, we're not going to do this anymore." So I was like, "Ugh, I guess I go back to writing a book." And but again, like shelved it for a while. Then I got on TikTok, and probably, about a year into TikTok, people were telling me all the time, "You should write a book. You should write a book."
You do. You have great,
And
and you're very easy to listen to. You express yourself very clearly, and you're talking about a very taboo topic that nobody wants to really understand. Nobody really wants to accept, right?
right,
So,
right,
and you make it very kind of lighthearted, and you kind of joke with it a little bit. And I think that you have to, right? You can't get all
yeah,
dark about it the whole time either, because then nobody's gonna watch you.
exactly. That's my philosophy. I like
Oh, he wants to talk. He wants to get on the podcast.
Chewbacca.
So,
Um,
is there any advice that you can give with what you've, encountered in your 20 years with the death process with family with family members who are dealing with a loved one dying, with the grieving process?
yeah, I
What
think
advice can you give them?
the best advice is to really talk to the person who's dying, and don't shut them down if they want to talk about it. Don't be afraid to have really hard conversations, because that's what I see the most is that people are afraid to acknowledge the elephant in the room. They're afraid to talk to the
Yeah.
dying person about the fact that they're dying because they don't want them to give up hope, thinking that'll make them die faster, which it won't. Or the dying person doesn't want to bring it up because it's going to bum their, loved ones out, which it's going to anyway. I mean, everybody knows what's happening. People know that they're dying, and I think it's really important to acknowledge that, because you can have the best end of life conversations, meaningful conversations, say goodbye, lots of closure, and no regrets.
Yeah, 100%. So in closing the podcast, you seem like your buddy needs to go pee or something.
So sorry.
No, it's okay. I love dogs. I have one right next to me right now too. Don't worry. So if
Yours is
there's
behaving better than
yeah,
mine.
oh yeah, it's a little boy, Baba. I have a little Havanese. Um, so one last thing, just in sharing with people anything that they want to take away from our conversation today in this podcast about dying and just living better lives, like what would it be that you can give them any advice, like seeing so many people die?
Yeah, I would say don't worry about it. It's going to happen whether you worry about it or not. And it's important to like live life every day as if it was your last because tomorrow isn't promised and death can happen at any time. And you're going to have a better death if you had a better life.
That's right. That's right. Well, Penny, I will be sharing in our YouTube channel in the comment section. I'll be sharing all of your social media links,
You?
TikTok and Facebook and Instagram and your YouTube so that everybody can find you. I'll share all the details on your book. I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for having this conversation with me. I was really excited about speaking with you. So thank you. I know you're busy and it is a Saturday night. So I'll be posting the episode today. Like I want this out there. I want this information out there. So thanks again,
All
every
right.
to everyone that's watching the Bear Experiment podcast. I thank you for your support. Please consider subscribing to our channel. Please like and share this story so that we can share amazing stories with other families that may be struggling with a loved one passing and grieving as well. So thank you very much. And thanks again, Penny. I hope you have a wonderful Saturday.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.